Hi guys, so we're going to do chapter 8. It's called The Last Night. So, Mr. Utterson was sitting by his fireside one evening after dinner when he was surprised to receive a visit from Poole. "Bless me, Poole, what brings you here?" he cried, and then, taking a second look at him, "What ails you?" he added. "Is the doctor ill?" "Mr. Utterson," said the man, "there is something wrong." "Take a seat and here is a glass of wine for you," said the lawyer. "Now, take your time and tell me plainly what you want." "Oh, you know the doctor's ways, sir," replied Poole, "and how he shuts himself up. Well, he's shut up again in the cabinet, and I don't like it, sir. I wish I may die if I like it. Mr. Utterson, sir, I'm afraid." "Now, my good man," said the lawyer, "be explicit. What are you afraid of?" So look, the word afraid is repeated about 3 times in this bit. Can you highlight it every time that it's there? Can you also highlight the bit where it says he's shut up again in the cabinet? So he's locked himself away in this very small room, and he's not letting anyone in or out. "I've been afraid for about a week," returned Poole, doggedly disregarding the question, "and I can bear it no more." I've underlined that. The man's appearance amply bore out his words. His manner was altered for the worse, and except for the moment when he had first announced his terror, he had not looked once at the lawyer in the face. So the word terror, I've underlined that as well. Even now, he sat with a glass of wine untasted on his knee, and his eyes directed to the corner of the floor. "I can bear it no more," he repeated. "Come," said the lawyer. "I see you have some good reason, Poole. I see there is something seriously amiss. Try to tell me what it is." "I think there's been foul play," said Poole hoarsely. Can you please post-it note that section, put a line to it? So foul play is like he thinks that there's been a murder or a crime happen. "Foul play?" cried the lawyer, a good deal frightened, please highlight that, and rather inclined to be irritated in consequence. "What foul play? What does the man mean?" "I daren't say, sir," was the answer, "but will you come along with me and see for yourself?" Mr. Utterson's only answer was to rise and get his hat and greatcoat, but he observed with wonder the greatness of the relief that appeared upon the butler's face. So I've highlighted the greatness of the relief that appeared upon the butler's face. So like, there's this whole discussion about the fact that poor people versus wealthy people and educated people versus, uneducated people. Like, oh, thank goodness the butler's going to get a smart man to come and help him out with his problem, is basically what it's kind of implying. And to me, in the 21st century, it's a little bit amusing and a bit offensive. But actually, what Stevenson is trying to say is that Poole knows there's something wrong. He doesn't know who to turn to. He hasn't gone to the police, interestingly enough, but he has gone to someone who really knows Dr. Jekyll, and he knows the situation, and he trusts him, and as a lawyer, he's a good person to go to. And perhaps with no less that the wine was still untasted when he set it down to follow. So it's obviously very important because this man has not even touched his wine, even though it's been given to him, and obviously there's lots of etiquette around that, and it will be nice wine because it's been given to him by somebody who has money to buy nice wines. Okay. This is a bit of an extract that I do sometimes, actually, this next section. It starts with some setting, and I have highlighted the pathetic fallacy used here, so if you're post-it noting, put that down here. "It was a wild, cold, seasonable night of March, with a pale moon lying on her back as though the wind had tilted her, and a flying wrack of the most diaphanous and lawny texture. The wind made talking difficult and flecked the blood into the face. It seemed to have swept the streets unusually bare of passengers, besides, for Mr. Utterson thought he had never seen that part of London so deserted." Please highlight that. So highlight the beginning bit about the wild, cold, seasonable, about the moon and the wind, and then that bit about London has never been so deserted. Obviously, it's a hyperbole, it's an exaggeration, but it's really effective, because if you're scared that somebody's not going to be able to hear you scream, or if something happens, there's nobody there to rescue you, it feels eerie and it's kind of classically gothic. So Utterson, even though he's the man of reason, is feeling perhaps a little irrational or maybe even a bit superstitious at this point. He could have wished it otherwise. Never in his life had he been conscious of so sharp a wish to see and touch his fellow creatures. Please highlight the fact that they're described as creatures there. For struggle as he might, there was borne in upon his mind a crushing anticipation of calamity. Please highlight that. Wow, we need to unpick that from a word level analysis. So you've got a crushing anticipation of calamity. So for the anticipation, the thing, to be described as crushing, that adjective there is something that's so intense and violent. And the idea that calamity means something terrible is going to happen. So it's like, it is superstitious. He feels just a gut feeling that has no rationality behind it at all, just a gut feeling that something really terrible is about to happen. The square, when they got there, was all full of wind and dust, and the thin trees in the garden were lashing themselves along the railing. Paul, who had kept all the way a pace or two ahead, now pulled up in the middle of the pavement, and in spite of the biting weather, took off his hat and mopped his brow with a red pocket handkerchief. But for all the hurry of his coming, these were not the dews of exertion that he wiped away, but the moisture of some strangling anguish. So I've highlighted the moisture of some strangling anguish. He's sweating, he's that frightened. For his face was white, and his voice, when he spoke, harsh and broken. "Well, sir," he said, "here we are, and God grant there be nothing." "Amen, Paul," said the lawyer. So he's hoping, now we're here, I hope it's nothing, I hope I've got you out of your bed for no reason, because if there's something there, it's going to be really terrible. Thereupon the servant knocked in a very guarded manner. The door was opened on a chain, and a voice asked from within, "Is that you, Paul?" "It's all right," said Paul. "Open the door." The hall, when they entered it, was brightly lighted up. The fire was built high, and about the hearth the whole of the servants, men and women, stood huddled together like a flock of sheep. At the sight of Mr. Utterson, the housemaid broke into hysterical whimpering. Please highlight that. And if you're post-it noting, I've put down the side, Utterson seems calm and reasoned, even with everybody else verging on hysteria. So the fact that all of the servants are all like huddled together for safety in numbers because they're so terrified, and the description of the housemaid suddenly breaking into hysterical whimpering and crying and stuff. We're supposed to see the contrast between how calm Utterson is and how frightened the others are. And the cook crying out, "Bless God, it's Mr. Utterson!" ran forward as if to take him in her arms. What? Are you all here?" said the lawyer peevishly. "Very irregular, very unseemly. Your master would be far from pleased." So Utterson, in classic Victorian gentleman style, is more annoyed that they're breaking etiquette and they're all hanging out together, which is just not the done thing, darling. "They're all afraid," said Paul. Please highlight that. Blank silence followed, no one protesting. Only the maid lifted up her voice and now wept loudly. "Hold your tongue," Paul said to her, with a ferocity of accent that testified to his own jangled nerves. And indeed, when the girl had so suddenly raised the note of her lamentation, they had all started and turned towards the inner door with faces of dreadful expectation. "And now," said the butler, addressing the knife boy, "reach me a candle and we'll get this through hands at once." And then he begged Mr. Utterson to follow him and led the way to the back garden. "Now, sir," he said, "you come as gently as you can. I want you to hear, and I don't want you to be heard. And see here, sir, if by any chance he was to ask you in, don't go." Mr. Utterson's nerves, as this unlooked-for termination, gave a jerk that nearly threw him from his balance. But he recollected his courage, please highlight that, and followed the butler into the laboratory building and through the surgical theatre, with its lumber of crates and bottles, to the foot of the stairs. Here Paul motioned him to stand on one side and listen, while he himself setting down the candle and making a great and obvious call on his resolution. So Paul is like really digging deep inside him, to find the strength to be able to continue with whatever it is that's happening right now. Mounted the steps and knocked with a somewhat uncertain hand on the red baize of the cabinet door. "Mr. Utterson, sir, asking to see you," he called, and even as he did so, once more violently signed to the lawyer to give ear. So he's like, "Listen." A voice answered from within. "Tell him I can't see anyone," it said complainingly. "Thank you, sir," said Paul, with a note of something like triumph in his voice, and taking up his candle. He led Mr. Utterson back across the yard and into the great kitchen, where the fire was out and the beetles were leaping on the floor. "Sir," he said, looking Mr. Utterson in the eyes, "was that my master's voice?" "It seemed much changed," replied the lawyer, very pale, but giving look for look. So he's not breaking eye contact. Utterson is still trying to keep it together, a lot more than Paul is. "Changed? Well, yes, I think so," said the butler. "Have I been 20 years in this man's house to be deceived by his voice? No, sir. Master's made away with. He was made away with 8 days ago when we heard him cry out upon the name of God. And who's in there instead of him, and why it stays there, is a thing that cries to heaven, Mr. Utterson." Please highlight that, and please post-it note this bit. Put a little star on your post-it note and say that 8 days ago the voice changed. So 8 days ago, it's been 8 days since Paul has heard Jekyll's voice. Okay, so he's heard I think we're supposed to assume that it's Mr. Hyde, because the last thing that Paul heard was Jekyll crying out upon the name of God. Please make a note about that's the last thing they heard him hear. And who's in there instead of him, and why it stays. It's described as it, so the use of it instead of he. And the thing that cries to heaven, it kind of sounds like something demonic is in there almost. This is a very strange tale, Paul. It is rather a wild tale, my man, and I've highlighted that, said Mr. Utterson, biting his finger. Suppose it were as you suppose, supposing Dr. Jekyll to have been, well, murdered. What could induce the murderer to stay? That won't hold water. It doesn't commend itself to reason. Well, Mr. Utterson, you are a hard man to satisfy, but I'll do it yet, said Paul. All this last week, you must know, him, or it, or whatever it is that lives in that cabinet, has been crying night and day for some sort of medicine and cannot get it to his mind. It was sometimes his way, the master's, that is, to write his orders on a sheet of paper and throw it on the stair. We've had nothing else this week back. Nothing but papers and a closed door, and the very meals left there to be smuggled in when nobody was looking. Well, sir, every day, and twice and thrice in the same day, there have been orders and complaints, and I've been sent flying to all the wholesale chemists in town. Every time I brought the stuff back, there would be another paper telling me to return it because it was not pure, and another order to a different firm. This drug is wanted bitter bad, sir, whatever for. So please highlight that last line about the drug is wanted bitter bad. So what's happened is the voice, and Paul is adamant, he's worked for him for 20 years, that it is not Jekyll's voice. The voice is demanding this particular drug, and he's sending him Paul back and forth all across London, trying to find somewhere that has the right type of chemical or drug or whatever it is that he needs. So this is one of the reasonings that Paul thinks that the thing is staying in there because it needs a drug of some sort. Like, he thinks it's a drug addict, essentially. Have you any of these papers? Asked Mr. Utterson. Paul felt in his pocket and handed out a crumpled note, which the lawyer, bending nearer to the candle, carefully examined. Its contents ran thus. Dr. Jekyll presents his compliments to Mrs. Moore. I don't know what that means. I can look that up in a minute. He assures them that their last sample, it must be a company that makes drugs, like a pharmaceutical, or a chemist, assures them that their last sample is impure and quite useless for his present purpose. In the year 18, Dr. J purchased a somewhat large quantity from these people. He now begs them to search with the most sedulous care, and should any of the same quantity be left, to forward it to him at once. Expense is no consideration. The importance of this to Dr. J can hardly be exaggerated. So far the letter had run composedly enough, but here, with a sudden splutter of the pen, the writer's emotion had broken loose. For God's sake, he'd added, find me some of the old. So whatever chemical Jekyll has bought from these people previously, whatever it is they're sending them is not the same, and it's not doing whatever it is it's meant to be doing. And it is written from Dr. Jekyll, so it's Dr. J. And even the fact that he's using for God's sake, we've talked about this quite a lot so far, he seems to be calling on everything to try and fix whatever his problem is. This is a strange note, said Mr. Utterson, and then sharply, how do you come to have it open? The man at Moore's was main angry, sir, and he threw it back to me like so much dirt, returned Paul. This is unquestionably the doctor's hand. Do you know? Resumed the lawyer. I thought it looked like it, said the servant rather sulkily, and then with another voice. But what matters hand of right, he said. I've seen him. Seen him? Replied Mr. Utterson. Well, that's it, said Paul. It was this way. I came suddenly into the theatre from the garden. It seems he'd slipped out to look for his drug or whatever it is, for the cabinet door was open, and there he was, at the far end of the room, digging among the crates. He looked up when I came in, gave a kind of cry, and whipped upstairs into the cabinet. It was but for 1 minute that I saw him, but the hair stood upon my head like quills. Sir, if that was my master, why had he a mask upon his face? Okay, so now this is quite a big bit. I don't think my timer thing is going to time out, so I'm hoping it doesn't. And this has also been an extract for an exam purpose. So I'd like you to please highlight... So the thing, it go back to, he looked up when I came in, gave a kind of cry and whipped upstairs into the cabinet. But for 1 minute I saw him, the hair stood up on my head like quills. So he uses, quills are the things like on porcupines that stand up. So we talk about having the hairs on the back of our neck stand up, but he uses a simile of like quills. It almost, anthropomorphizes Paul, it makes him seem like an animal. Like his instinct is like not just like, oh, the hairs, but like everything. Like the defensive mechanism of an animal kicks in when he sees this thing scurrying around in the crates. I mean, even just digging around the crates makes him sound like an animal. So please highlight the hair stood up on my head like quills, and if you could put on your post-it note, animal instinct, defensive, Paul is having a reaction to him. Sir, if that was my master, why had he a mask upon his face? Please highlight that. It's not like him. If we know from doing Lord of the Flies that the concept of a mask is that you are not the person that you're supposed to be. So he's saying it's not Jekyll. Whatever it is, it's covering up his real identity, it's giving him some kind of anonymity, whatever. If it was my master, why did he cry out like a rat and run from me? Please highlight that simile. Why did he cry out like a rat? So the imagery there, again, it's animalistic, making him seem like an animal. Rats, you know, in London, in this time period, dirty, dirty streets. Rats were vermin, scum, they carried disease and dirt, and scrabbling around searching for something makes him seem like vermin. That's a really, really good one to have noted down on a post-it note also. I have served him long enough, and then the man paused and passed his hand over his face. These are all very strange circumstances, said Mr. Utterson. But I think I begin to see daylight. Your master, Paul, is plainly seized with one of those maladies that both torture and deform the sufferer. Okay, so highlight that. This is Utterson, again, still trying to rationalise everything. Gosh, bless him. So he says that there must be a medical reason for this. It must be one of those like a facial palsy or something that's distorted his face or something like that, and something that's tortured the mind, so perhaps sent him spiralling. So still Utterson trying to find a medical reason for why it would be Jekyll but not be Jekyll. Hence, for aught I know, the alteration of his voice, hence the mask and his avoidance of his friends, hence his eagerness to find this drug, by means of which the poor soul retains some hope of ultimate recovery. God grant that he not be deceived. There is my explanation. It is sad enough, Paul, aye, and appalling to consider, but it is plain and natural, hangs well together, and delivers us all from exorbitant alarms. So it's like, this is a really good explanation for everything that's happening right now. If he's been distorted, and he needs this drug to make himself feel better. Obviously, he's a doctor. He would know what to prescribe himself, and he's hoping that he'll be able to fix himself before anybody really becomes any the wiser of his problem. Sir, said the butler, turning to a sort of mottled pallor, that thing was not my master, and there's the truth. Highlight that. And the thing. I have no idea what all these noises are in my house, by the way. I can't tell whether the background noise is getting picked up. I think my husband might be hoovering, the children are, maybe drilling. I don't know. Sorry about that. I'm actually going to stop in a moment. I'm just going to get to the bottom of this bit. That thing was not my master, and there's the truth. My master, here he looked round him and began to whisper, is a tall, fine build of a man, and this was more of a dwarf. So I'm actually going to stop there, because that actually is where one of the extracts, one of the exams stops. And describing him, he's obviously very, very small. Now, where have we heard the term dwarfish before? Mr. Hyde. So that is a clue to the reader that he thinks that Mr. Hyde is still in there. So now Utterson's like, okay, I'm not quite sure where to go with my definition, because even a medical complaint wouldn't suddenly make you really short. It might mess around with your facial features or even your voice, but it's not going to make you really short when you were previously a tall, large man. So clearly there is something really strange going on, and it would appear that it isn't Dr. Jekyll who was coming out of the cabinet. So I'm going to pause there, because I think I am going to run out of time soon. So just maybe make a little note in your book so you know where to come back to, because it's pretty much in the middle of a big paragraph. Okay.